He married her for power, but her cold reply changed everything forever. The words were a blade, unsheathed before she had even finished freeing her hair from its pins. I will not pretend to love you. Grace Darrow. Grace Prescott. Now, as of 11 o'clock that morning, the Duchess of Harrowgate. The ink was dry. The chapel doors had closed on one life and opened onto another, a future neither of them had chosen. She stood frozen at the dressing table in the bedchamber that was now a cage of gilded silk, and stared at her husband's reflection in the merciless silvered glass. He stood by the door, a sentinel guarding the entrance to their shared prison. He had shed his coat, but not his waistcoat, a man still armored for battle. His body was a rigid line of composure, the posture of a man delivering a verdict he had rehearsed until it was stripped of all feeling. Shoulders set like stone. Chin level. Hands clasped behind his back in a stance she would come to know intimately, the posture he adopted in the House of Lords just before he gutted an opponent with cold, unassailable logic. Richard Prescott, 7th Duke of Harrowgate, was a man of 33 years. He possessed a jaw constructed for the singular purpose of clenching against the world, and eyes that were pits of dark, serious thought, giving nothing away. He was not handsome. Not in the way London's perfumed salons understood the word. He was too angular, too severe, a creature carved from the stone of his own northern moors. He was the antithesis of the polished men who glittered at balls. He was handsome in the way a fortress wall is handsome, functional, unyielding, and built to withstand a siege. And in this moment, he was being more honest than any man had ever been with her in her entire, carefully managed life. I married you because your father's shipping interests are a necessary artery for this estate's wool. A reliable export route. He continued, his tone as measured and cold as a winter morning. And, because my mother, on her deathbed, extracted a promise that I would marry before my 35th year. Time, as you can imagine, was becoming a factor. You are intelligent. You are sensible. Your father's solicitor did not haggle over the terms. For that, I respect you. I believe we can forge something workable from this union. But I will not stand in this room and perform a feeling I do not possess. I believe you deserve more than a performance. Grace placed the hairpin she was holding onto the polished mahogany. The tiny metallic sound echoed in the crushing silence. She turned on the stool, a slow, deliberate movement, to face the man who was now her husband. She studied him for a long, silent beat. The rigid shoulders. The clenched jaw. The dark, watchful eyes of a man who had just thrown a grenade into the room and was bracing for the explosion. He expected to be hated. He was prepared to accept it. Good, she said. The word was a single, clean shot. Neither will I. His expression remained a mask of stone, but behind it, a tectonic plate shifted. A flicker in the depths of his eyes. A fractional, almost imperceptible loosening of the jaw. It was the reaction of a man who had braced for a physical blow and instead felt the ground beneath his feet solidify. You are not offended, he stated, a question disguised as an observation. I am relieved. She folded her hands in her lap, a portrait of serene composure. I have spent the last 6 weeks of my life girding myself for this marriage. I knew precisely what it was, a business arrangement swathed in white silk and false sentiment. My father requires your land routes. Your estate requires his ships. I am the living, breathing clause in the contract that launders the transaction into something respectable. I understood this when I accepted the terms. I accepted because the alternative was to refuse, and in doing so, to watch my father's enterprise collapse, taking my mother and my 2 younger brothers down with it into ruin. She paused. The candlelight on the dressing table danced, caught in a draft from the window. It was the November wind, a relentless predator, finding the weaknesses in the casement. She would later learn this wind was the true master of Harrowgate, a 300-year-old monument to grandeur, not to warmth. So no, she repeated, her voice steady and clear. I will not pretend. I do not love you. I do not even know you. What I do know is that you are direct, a quality I find valuable. And you have chosen brutal honesty over saccharine comfort on our wedding night. That alone tells me more about your character than 6 weeks of stilted courtship ever could. If we are to build something, let us build it on this hard, cold ground, not on a lie that would poison us both with its maintenance. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, thick with the one thing neither of them had anticipated finding in this room, the sudden, shocking relief of 2 soldiers who, upon meeting on a battlefield, discover they have been fighting the same secret war alone. I had prepared myself to be kind about it, Richard admitted, his voice losing some of its rigid control. I had an entire speech rehearsed. About how affection can, on occasion, grow with time. Was it a good speech? It was abysmal. I practiced it in the carriage on the way here. Grace felt a ghost of a movement at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, not yet. But the structural possibility of one. A blueprint. I practiced one as well, she confessed. It was about patience and understanding and the misplaced trust that mutual respect could serve as a foundation for some deeper feeling. Was yours better than mine? It was appalling. My mother helped me write it. He almost smiled. The architecture was there, a flicker of light in the grim fortress of his face. You could see what it might one day become, even if it was not yet habitable. Then we are agreed, he said, his tone formal once more. No pretending. No pretending. I will not come to your bed tonight. I believe we should first learn the shape of this new arrangement. I agree. He inclined his head, a gesture of stark formality. He retrieved his coat from the chair where it lay. He walked to the connecting door between their chambers, a monstrous thing of heavy oak and iron hinges that had separated the dukes and duchesses of Harrowgate for 3 centuries. He paused, his hand on the cold iron handle. Grace, he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name since the hollow vows in the chapel. Thank you. For not making me feel worse about this than I already do. You feel badly about it. I feel badly that you deserved a man who loved you on your wedding night. Instead, you received a man who can offer you a wool export route and a single, honest conversation. It is not what you should have had. It is, she said, her voice cutting through his self-recrimination, the first truly honest conversation I have had with a man in my 24 years of existence. It may be more valuable than you think. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. Then he opened the door, stepped through it, and closed it behind him. The sound of the latch was a final, definitive click. And Grace sat at the dressing table in the flickering candlelight, listening to the November wind probe every crack in the ancient house, and she thought, this is not what I expected. This might be better. The first weeks were a careful, intricate dance. They breakfasted together, he at the head of the long, polished oak table, she at the foot. The wood between them was a vast, gleaming chasm, both literal and metaphorical. He ate with methodical precision. She ate with the absent-minded efficiency of a woman whose mind was already 3 moves ahead of her fork. Their conversations were a dry recitation of facts, the household, the estate, the duties that now fell to her as the new duchess. They never spoke of their wedding night. They did not need to. The brutal honesty of that first encounter had forged the terms of their contract, and the terms were diamond clear. They were partners in an enterprise. The enterprise was Harrowgate. Feelings, or the stark absence of them, were irrelevant to the successful operation of the business. Grace had been raised in the temple of enterprise. She understood this one. What she did not understand, in those initial, freezing weeks, was the house itself. Harrowgate was a beast unlike any building she had ever known. Her father's house in Hull was a monument to practicality, brick, well-heated, designed by a man who believed a house's sole purpose was to repel the weather and contain its people. Harrowgate existed for other, more arrogant reasons. It was built in the 16th century by a duke who equated grandeur with morality. Expanded in the 17th by a duke obsessed with a brutal, imposing symmetry. Neglected in the 18th by a duke who found London infinitely more compelling than his crumbling ancestral seat, allowing the entire East Wing to develop a lean that the current estate architect, with a coward's understatement, described as characterful. Grace walked every corridor. She opened every door. Her hand on the cold brass knobs was a challenge to the dust and the silence. She stood in rooms that had not been breached in decades, her senses on high alert, noting the state of the crumbling plaster, the quality of the weak, watery light, the specific, cloying smell of a space that has been sealed for so long it has forgotten the very concept of air. She carried a notebook, a plain, leather-bound ledger she had purchased in Hull. In it, she waged her war. She wrote down everything, the number of rooms, the condition of every window, the name of every servant, their function, their years of service, and her own cold assessment of whether they were competent or merely present. Mrs. Hewitt, the housekeeper, was a woman of 55 who had served the Harrowgate household for 21 years. She greeted the arrival of a new duchess with the same professional deference and private, ruthless assessment a battlefield general gives a new commanding officer. She guided Grace through the house, room by decaying room. From the grand reception halls, sealed since the old duke's funeral, to the cavernous attic storerooms, where 3 generations of furniture sat shrouded in dust sheets like an army of ghosts awaiting a summons. On the 3rd day, Grace found the accounts room. It was a small, cramped chamber off the steward's office, lined with shelves groaning under the weight of 30 years of ledgers. She sat at the desk and began to read, starting with the most recent year and working her way backwards into the past. She read for 4 hours, a forensic accountant dissecting a corpse. When Mrs. Hewitt finally found her, her face a mask of growing concern because new duchesses were not supposed to vanish into the financial heart of the estate, Grace looked up without preamble. The pineapple subscription has been running for 9 years. Who authorized it? Mrs. Hewitt's expression was that of a woman whose initial, cautious assessment was undergoing a violent, seismic revision. The previous Duke, Your Grace. He had a fondness for exotic fruit. The previous Duke has been dead for 8 years. Yes, Your Grace. And the pineapple has continued to arrive? Yes, Your Grace. Does anyone eat it? No, Your Grace. The kitchen staff transform it into a compost that no one ever requests. The remainder goes to the pigs. Grace made a sharp, decisive note in her leather book. The pigs, she said, her voice devoid of emotion, have been living better than the Eastern tenants. She turned back to the ledgers. Mrs. Hewitt withdrew. That evening, she remarked to the cook, with the careful neutrality of a woman who dealt in observation, not opinion, she found the pineapple. The cook, a woman who had been making unwanted pineapple compost for nearly a decade, closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank God." Grace absorbed it all. She was the daughter of a merchant. Mr. Jonas Darrow had built a shipping empire from a single, borrowed vessel into a fleet of 14. She had been raised to understand that every enterprise, whether it moved wool across the North Sea or managed 300 years of accumulated silver, operated on the same brutal principles. Know what you have. Know what it costs. And know where the rot of inefficiency is hiding. She found it with terrifying speed. Harrowgate had been run by men for a decade. The old Duke, a widower, had never remarried. Richard had inherited at 25 and managed the estate with Marsden the steward and Mrs. Hewitt, all with a bachelor's profound indifference to domestic detail. The result was a house that functioned, but did not thrive. A body kept alive on a machine, but with no soul. The linens had not been inventoried in 4 years. The kitchen accounts showed a slow, steady hemorrhage of funds with no corresponding improvement in quality. The tenants' cottages on the eastern boundary were in desperate need of repairs that Marsden had noted in his ledgers, but had never actioned. No one had told him to. Grace actioned them. She did it quietly, without fanfare, with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had been watching her father conduct business since she was old enough to sit on his knee. She eviscerated the kitchen accounts and found a butcher in the village who charged a third less than the one in York. She organized the linen inventory and discovered the house owned 47 sets of bedsheets, 11 of which had not been touched since the Napoleonic Wars. She wrote to the tenants on the eastern boundary, personally, in her own clean, sharp hand, explaining that the repairs would commence before Christmas. Marsden, upon learning of the letters, came to find Richard in the study. He was a man of 40 who had been steward since the old Duke's time, a man who operated with the slow, methodical caution of someone who believed that urgency was the enemy of efficiency. "The Duchess has written to the tenants," he announced. "Has she?" "She has promised repairs before Christmas." "I have been planning those repairs for the spring." "Then it appears they will happen sooner than you planned." Marsden opened his mouth, then closed it. A man recognizing a superior force. He left. He never argued with the Duchess again. He did not need to. Within a month, he had learned what Mrs. Hewitt and the cook and the eastern tenants were already discovering. Grace Prescott did not make promises she could not keep. The most efficient response to her decisions was not resistance. It was immediate, unconditional compliance. Richard did not notice at first. He was in London 3 days a week, the House of Lords in session. He sat through every debate with the grim determination of a man for whom governance was a moral obligation, a penance to be served. When he was at Harrowgate, he was cloistered in the study with Marsden, poring over estate accounts. It was Mrs. Hewitt who delivered the news. "The Duchess has reorganized the kitchen accounts," she said, standing in the study doorway, her expression that of a messenger unsure if her news would be welcomed or seen as a threat. "Has she?" "She has reduced the monthly expenditure by £12. Without altering the menu." Richard looked up from his correspondence. £12. She found a new butcher in the village. And she cancelled the standing order for hothouse fruit from York. The one which no one eats in winter and which has been delivered every week for 9 years because no one ever thought to tell them to stop. "I eat hothouse fruit. You eat an apple from the orchard, Your Grace. You have never, in my 21 years of observation, touched the hothouse pineapple." Richard leaned back in his chair. He had married a woman for her father's ships and had received, in the bargain, a forensic accountant who could identify a 9-year surplus of unwanted tropical fruit. He was not certain what to do with this information. He found her in the morning room that evening. She was at the desk she had claimed, a small writing table near the window that had once held a vase of dried, dead flowers and now held a ledger, an ink pot, and a stack of correspondence organized by brutal urgency. She was writing a letter, her hair pinned loosely, her Spencer jacket removed. She wore a plain, dove-gray wool day dress, well-made but unadorned. It was the uniform of a woman who valued function over display. "Mrs. Hewitt tells me you cancelled the pineapple. It was costing 8 shillings a week. No one was eating it. What did you do with the last one?" "I sent it to the vicar's wife." She was delighted. She had never seen a pineapple before. Richard leaned against the doorframe, a posture of feigned relaxation. "You sent a pineapple to the vicar's wife?" "I did. She has invited us to dinner on Thursday in gratitude." "I accepted. I hope that is agreeable." "The vicar is a bore." "The vicar's wife is not. She knows every tenant family on the eastern boundary by name, which is more than Marsden does. And she has opinions about the drainage on the lower meadow that I believe you should hear." Richard looked at her. This woman he had married for ships, sitting at a desk she had purged of dead things, now dispatching pineapples to vicars' wives and soliciting drainage opinions from women the estate had never deemed worthy of consultation. He felt something he had not anticipated. Not attraction, not yet. Not affection. It was too soon for that. It was something closer to pure, unadulterated curiosity. The dawning, unsettling awareness that the person in this room was infinitely more complex and interesting than the terms of their contract had ever required her to be. "I will come to the vicar's dinner," he said. "But I reserve the right to leave if he begins talking about his collection of Roman coins." "He will begin talking about his collection of Roman coins. He always does. Mrs. Hewitt warned me. I have prepared 3 questions about Roman drainage systems that should successfully redirect the conversation toward something useful." "You prepared questions?" "I prepare for everything, Your Grace. It is how I was raised." "Richard," he said, the name a sharp command. "If we are not pretending, then we shall not pretend to be formal." "My name is Richard." She looked up at him. The structural possibility of a smile that had appeared on their wedding night finally completed itself. Not a broad, open thing. He would later learn those were reserved for moments of genuine shock. This was a real one, but quiet, precise. The smile of a woman who had just been given something she valued, a small, voluntary step toward familiarity. "Richard," she said. "My name is Grace. But you knew that." "I did. I have not used it enough." The vicar's dinner was as crushingly tedious as Richard had predicted, and as ruthlessly useful as Grace had planned. The vicar droned on about Roman coins for precisely 11 minutes before Grace deployed her first drainage question. The conversation was expertly rerouted to the lower meadow. This, in turn, unleashed the vicar's wife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Cartwright, who had resided in the parish for 30 years. She proceeded to describe, in forensic detail, which cottages leaked, which roofs needed rehatching, and which tenant families were being silently crushed as winter approached. Richard listened. He realized with a jolt that he had never truly listened to the vicar's wife before. He had attended these parish dinners as a duty, endured them as a punishment, and escaped as soon as courtesy allowed. Grace had weaponized the same dinner, turning it into an intelligence-gathering exercise. She had done it with a single pineapple and 3 prepared questions. In the carriage ride home, cloaked in darkness, the November wind rattling the windows like a caged beast, he said, "You are very good at this." "At what?" "At making things work. At finding the useful component inside the tedious one. He paused, hunting for the right word. "At seeing what is actually there, instead of what is supposed to be there." Grace was quiet for a moment, the carriage rocking violently over a rut in the road. "My father taught me," she said, her voice a low murmur in the dark. "He built his company from one ship and a borrowed desk. He could not afford the luxury of seeing what was supposed to be there. He had to see what was actually there, and then he had to decide what to do about it. He taught me in the same way. He would say, 'Grace, the world will show you what it wants you to see. Your job is to see what it is hiding.' He sounds formidable. He is. He is also the reason I am in this carriage, married to a duke I do not love. Because his ships needed your routes, and your estate needed his fleet. And I am the clause that made it all respectable." She said this without a trace of bitterness. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a clear-eyed directness that he was beginning to understand was not a choice for her, but a fundamental part of her nature. "But I do not resent it. My father gave me the tools to be useful anywhere. Harrowgate is simply the place where I am being useful now. You are more than useful." She turned to look at him in the suffocating darkness of the carriage. He couldn't see her expression, but he could feel the weight of her attention, the focused, unhurried consideration of a woman who weighed every word before accepting it into evidence. That, she said, is the first thing you have said to me that was not strictly accurate. But I appreciate the intention behind it. It was accurate. It was kind. There is a difference. Not always, he said. The carriage carried them home through the black, swallowing night. Neither of them spoke again. But the silence was different. It was not the chasm of distance they shared over the breakfast table. It was proximity. The charged silence of two people who had just discovered the space between them was smaller and far more dangerous than they had assumed. Christmas arrived, a cold breath on the moors. Grace organized the household celebration with the same systematic competence she applied to a shipping ledger. Decorations placed with geometric precision. The menu planned for maximum impact and minimum waste. The tenants' gifts assembled and distributed on Christmas Eve, each with a personal note, in her own hand, for every family. She had learned all their names. Not just the tenant farmers, but their wives, their children, the ages of their children, the specific, silent struggles of each household. Mrs. Mitchell on the eastern boundary was expecting her fourth child in February. Grace had arranged for the midwife's fee to be covered by the estate. Mr. Hargreaves in the South Cottage had a son who showed a talent for reading. Grace had already written to the parish school in the next village to secure a place. The widow Carmichael, whose husband had died in October and whose roof was the first Grace had ordered repaired, received a basket containing a ham, preserves, candles, and a letter that said simply, "You are not alone. The estate is here. I am here." Marsden, who had been steward for 15 years and still referred to the eastern tenants by their plot numbers, watched her walk through the village on Christmas morning, greeting people by name, carrying a basket of Mrs. Hewitt's mince pies. He said to Richard, who walked beside him, a silent observer, "She knows more of them than I do." "She knows more of everything than either of us," Richard replied. "It is best to accept it early." That afternoon, they walked together through the grounds. The frost had not yet thawed, and the skeletal trees along the drive were etched in silver against a pale, unforgiving sky. The house loomed behind them, gray stone, tall windows, 3 centuries of grandeur and rot. For the first time Richard could remember, it looked like a place that was being inhabited, rather than merely occupied. "Your letters to the tenants," he said. "The personal ones. With the notes about their children. What about them?" "My mother did the same thing. Before she died. She wrote to every family at Christmas. I found the drafts in her desk after the funeral. I did not continue the practice. I should have." Grace walked beside him, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel, the only sound in the frozen world. "You did not continue it because you did not know how," she said, her voice devoid of judgment. "There is no shame in that. You kept the estate solvent. You kept the tenants housed and a roof over their heads. You sat in the House of Lords and voted on laws that affected their livelihoods. You did what you knew how to do. I am doing what I know how to do. Between us, the enterprise is covered. You keep calling it an enterprise. It is an enterprise. Marriage, estate, household. They are all enterprises. The only difference between this and my father's shipping company is that the cargo is people's lives instead of wool. And the returns are measured in something other than money." "What are they measured in?" She looked at him. The frost had reddened her cheeks and her breath plumed in the cold air. And she was, he thought with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, beautiful. Not in the way London understood beauty, but in the way a well-run enterprise was beautiful, efficient, purposeful, and entirely without waste. "I'm still calculating," she said. On Christmas night, after the last servant had retired and the candles had burned low, when the house was finally quiet in the way that old houses are quiet on winter nights, not silent, but settling, the stones and timbers groaning against the cold, Richard knocked on the connecting door. Grace opened it. She was in her nightgown, her hair unbound, a shawl clutched around her shoulders, a book in her hand. She looked at him without a shred of surprise, as if she had been expecting the knock, but had not known on which night it would finally come. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the carriage. That the first thing I said to you that was not strictly accurate was when I said you are more than useful. I remember. You were wrong. It was accurate. I have spent the past 2 months watching you remake this house. Not with drama, not with noise, but completely. You found the pineapple. You found the tenants. You found the vicar's wife. You found the gap in the linens, and the gap in the kitchen accounts, and the gap in Marsden's knowledge of his own people. And you filled every single one of them, without asking for recognition or gratitude or anything at all." Grace stood in the doorway, clutching her book and her shawl, and she looked at him with the same careful, assessing expression he had seen on their wedding night. But something else was there now. Something that had not existed before. The first, faint evidence of a woman allowing herself to want something she had ruthlessly told herself she did not need. I did not fill every gap, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Which one remains? She looked at him. He looked at her. The connecting door stood open between them, the oak and iron barrier that had separated dukes and duchesses for 3 centuries. And on either side stood 2 people who had agreed to build something on a foundation of honesty and were now discovering, with the slow, terrifying clarity of those who have kept their word, that honesty had built something neither of them had ever planned for. This one, she said. He stepped through the door. The winter bled into spring. The connecting door remained open. Not symbolically. Literally. Grace had instructed Marsden to have the bolt removed. When Mrs. Hewitt noticed, she said nothing, but she began placing fresh flowers on both sides of the door frame each morning, which was her way of expressing approval without resorting to words. Grace wrote to her father weekly. The letters were detailed, practical, and stripped of sentiment. She reported on the estate's accounts, the new shipping routes, the quality of the wool clip. She did not tell him she was happy. She told him that the enterprise was sound. Mr. Darrow, who understood his daughter better than any person alive, read between the lines. He said to his wife, "She is happy. She just doesn't know how to say it yet. She'll figure it out. She figures everything out." Her father visited in March. He arrived in a hired carriage, refusing to use the Harroweight coaches on principle. A merchant did not borrow from an aristocrat, even one who was his son-in-law. He walked through the house with the cold, assessing eye of a man who evaluated assets for a living. He inspected the wool stores. He examined the shipping manifests. At dinner, he sat at Richard's table and drank Richard's wine, and watched his daughter discuss the merits of overland versus coastal wool transport with the quiet authority of a master. "You have done well with her," he said to Richard. "I have not done anything with her," Richard replied, setting down his glass. "She has done it all herself." Mr. Darrow looked at him for a long, silent moment. Then he nodded. A single, firm incline of the head. The gesture of a man who has just revised his assessment of an investment from satisfactory to excellent. "That is the correct answer," he said. Later, Grace found Richard in the study. "My father approves of you." "How can you tell?" "He gave you the nod." "He has 3 nods. The first means acceptable. The second means better than expected. The third," she paused. "The third is the one he gave my mother when she told him she was carrying my brother. It means the enterprise has exceeded all projections." "Which nod did I receive?" "The third." Richard looked at her across the desk. She looked back at him. And for the first time, neither of them was being careful. Neither was measuring the distance or weighing their words. They were simply sitting in a room together, in the easy, unperforming silence of 2 people who had stripped away every pretense and discovered that what remained was worth keeping. That spring, Richard sat in the House of Lords and listened to a debate on trade regulation. He found himself thinking, for the first time, of what Grace would say. She would say the proposed tariff was designed to protect estates like his at the expense of merchants like her father. And she would say it not with rancor, but with data. And she would be right. He voted against the tariff. Lord Petherham, astonished, asked him why. "My wife explained the economics," Richard said simply. "Your wife?" "She is more qualified to discuss trade policy than anyone in this chamber. If the Lords admitted women, she would have my seat." Petherham laughed. Richard did not. He was not joking. Their daughter was born the following autumn. A girl they named after no one, because Grace wanted the child to begin without the weight of inheritance, even that of a name. They called her Marin. A name Grace had found in a book of Norse history, because Harroweight was in the north, and the north remembered the old names. Mrs. Hewitt held the baby first, after the midwife, which was a breach of protocol but was, by that point, inevitable. Her loyalty to the Duchess was a fierce, protective thing. She held Marin and said to the infant, in a voice meant for Grace, "You will be formidable. It is unavoidable." Mr. Darrow arrived from Hull within 3 days. He held his granddaughter with the careful precision of a man handling precious cargo. "She has your mother's chin, your father's stubbornness, and your sense of timing. A good omen." "Everything is an omen to you, father," Grace said from her bed. "Everything is an omen when you pay attention," he retorted. Richard held his daughter in the library that night and looked at Grace, exhausted and triumphant, her clear, assessing eyes still watching him. He said, "I need to correct something." "What?" "On our wedding night, I told you I would not pretend to love you. I am not pretending now. I need you to know the difference." Grace looked at him, this angular, severe, unyielding man who had delivered honesty like a death sentence, and who had spent every day since proving that honesty, when met with its equal, could grow into something for which they had no words on the night they began. "I know the difference," she said. "I have known for some time. How long? Since the pineapple. He stared at her. The pineapple? You came to the morning room. You leaned against the door frame and asked me about the pineapple. And you looked at me as though I were the most confounding puzzle you had ever encountered. No one had ever looked at me that way. My father looks at me with pride. My mother looks at me with worry. You looked at me with curiosity. As though you had opened a ledger expecting columns of numbers and found a novel instead. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. And it involves a pineapple. I am not a romantic person. No, he said, holding their daughter, looking at his wife. You are better than that. You are an honest one. The fire burned. Marin slept. Outside, the November wind found every gap in the casement, just as it had on their wedding night. But the house was warm now. Not because the gaps had been sealed. They were structural, the stonemason had explained. But because the rooms were filled with people who had chosen to be in them, together, without pretending. Mrs. Hewitt, passing the library on her final round, heard the Duke laughing and the Duchess saying something about pineapple economics. She closed the door quietly and went downstairs. She told the cook, who was banking the fire for the night, the Enterprise is sound. The cook, who did not understand the reference, merely nodded. Mrs. Hewitt poured herself a small glass of the Duke's port, a liberty she had taken for 21 years. She drank it, standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the November dark. And she thought it was the pineapple. It was always going to be the pineapple. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here like an honest word spoken in a room where no one expected it. Whenever they are ready.